Hello, everybody. Welcome to AAA Radio. Today we're back with a new book that we've spent some time digesting. This time it's a little different. It's the book Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, if I pronounce that right, which consists of the original Notes from the Underground and the follow-up part, Apropos of the Wet Snow. While most of the books we have read together so far have addressed societal issues and fundamental questions about the nature of man and nature of civilization, they do so while following a narrative structure. They tend to follow a smaller story within the grander questions or concerns that they propose, and use that story as an allegory or example of the issues that they wish to highlight. Notes and Apropos essentially abandon this structure. It instead chooses to delve directly into the viewpoints and philosophies that cause its existence, with very little happening outside of the philosophical musings it speaks about. Apropos of the Wet Snow does return somewhat to the more commonly used narrative as a means of conveying the message, but still presents a narrative as being secondary to the thoughts of the narrator, directly addressing the reader. Set in the 1860s and 1840s respectively, yes, in that order, books act as the self-chronicles of an unnamed man known simply as the Underground Man. The Underground Man rejects much of what is normally accepted by the society of his time. Grandiose ideas such as romanticism and utilitarianism are the trend of the era, to his chagrin. He vehemently dives into his own school of thought, which rejects utilitarianism on the basis that man will do whatever it takes to assert his own complete free will, even at the expense of what is reasonable and happy. His ideas make sense in a way, but it is clear that he has not benefited from them. He spends his days in a painful juxtaposition between hating himself and hating others, egoism and masochism, claims of superiority and an inability to act, such that eventually he admits that he can only be defined by what he is not. With this summary in mind, let us move on to arbitrating the scattered pieces of this book. What do you guys think of the Underground Man?
Vile and a little bit disgusting, but I feel like that is really the point, is that we all see a little bit of ourselves in him, and in that way it's really a commentary that Dostoevsky is trying to really expose this aspect of human nature.
Yeah, I did find that to be quite rejectable. Through reading the whole book, I wasn't able to find, I don't think, a single truly good quality about him. There is reason to sympathize with him, and there is reason to believe that, yes, he isn't wholly bad. He isn't a bad person at his interior. Like he himself said, he isn't quite vile enough to become a bad person, nor is he lazy enough to become a lazy bones, nor is he good enough to become a saint. So while there does seem to be that sense of, that he is not a bad person necessarily, but he does not seem to be a likable person at the very least.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the extent to which he introspects and is self-aware? I thought that was a pretty unique aspect of the book, is how he's constantly self-analyzing and constantly rationalizing things about himself, which I didn't really find in other books. So I'm wondering what y'all think of that. And is that a desirable quality for someone, or is he telling himself that he's great when he's really not?
I don't think the Underground Man himself would know what to think of himself if you were to ask him the question. Honestly, I think it's part of the book is just someone who's utterly confused and what anything means ever, or what the purpose to do things are for.
You seem to disagree, Shaswata.
No.
I feel like he overanalyzes in a way that it kind of defeats his purpose.
Yeah.
How so? Could you expand on that?
He gives himself a lot of credit, as if he's really, really amazing. I don't know. It feels like he mentions at the start that, in fact, he is not writing for an audience, but the manner in which he writes is really almost as if he wants to show off in a way that it is for an audience. So I felt in a way although there is a sense of sincerity, there's also this veil that tries to portray him in a better way.
I do actually agree with that because from what it seems to me, that it seems like that was quite purposeful by the author, because the author in both senses of the word, like the author as in Dostoevsky himself, because first of all, Dostoevsky, I feel like he's trying to make it so that we don't necessarily trust him as a narrator, because perhaps he feels that if we were to just straight up trust him, if the person through which he told this story, told this philosophy, was just so easily trustable that we would just accept what he says as fact, that would ruin the whole purpose of the philosophy that is proposed, which is that the philosophy is essentially the rejection. The philosophy is the rejection of all of the philosophies. It's a rejection that there is, in fact, a set criteria in the world. He rejects utilitarianism in that there is a set guide by which you can make what is good and what is bad, by considering what is pleasurable to man and what is not. And if we were to simply just trust the narrator, that would defeat that whole purpose of there is a truthful philosophy. But at the same time, there's the other aspect from the narrator's perspective himself, because I think at some point the narrator does mention that he mentions himself, like you mentioned the audience, right, Yusuf? He doesn't write for an audience part of it.
Yeah.
So I did feel that, because right after that he essentially goes into the musing of, okay, if I'm not writing for an audience, why am I putting so much effort into this fake book if I will not reveal their true books? So there is that sense of he's actually contemplating whether by writing for an audience that he's not writing for an audience, he's in fact writing for an audience, and thus is trying to accept the values that he's putting down onto this paper, which he claims to be fake.
So it's this idea that by writing, it's for an audience either way.
Yeah, in a sense.
I think he's kind of retrospectively justifying his activities in a way. Like, he's not planning anything, right? Like, I think the sequence where he, in the second part where he goes with the party, he just keeps explaining himself after the fact and keeps saying, no, I shouldn't do this, but no, I have to. I think that's like, not as, even though he comes off sometimes as very narcissistic or egotistic, I don't think it's necessarily egotism, but rather attempting to justify his actions as being more meaningful than anyone else, I suppose. Like, it comes out to me as someone who's desperately trying to understand why they do any things they do. So that, like, that constant back and forth isn't necessarily that he's an untrustworthy narrator, but rather he genuinely doesn't understand his own philosophy and is trying to make sense of it on his way.
That's a really good point, and I guess that also plays with the fact that he's like as if he's not writing for an audience, because it's not really planned. Rather, it's coming more fluidly and naturally.
That's one of the major conflicts that the author is trying to put us through, right? It's that question of, do you wish to trust this man? Can you trust this man? You're continuing to read this book, so does that mean that you are trusting this man? So it's the sense of he doesn't even really trust himself, does he? Because he doesn't trust himself to be able to make decisions without considering every repercussion, which is why throughout the entire book, any choice that he makes, he usually spends months planning even the smallest social interaction, and then essentially not really being able to go through with it, or if he does go through with it, it is very small and, in a sense, from the normal perspective, undeserving of all the amount of attention that he put to it. Like, for example, when we think about his decision to try to stand up to that one soldier guy, right? He initially planned to just straight up challenge him to a duel, but then he started fretting about whether or not he would accept the duel or not. And then he felt that he would prove to be the soldier's equal in a way that was not a duel. And then he spends months, or what at least feels like months, building up a wardrobe that would give him a social standing similar to that of the soldier, only to go and bump into him and be ignored, and then yet somehow be satisfied with that despite the severe anticlimatism of that gesture.
I agree.
Yeah.
Like, he in the start, he especially compares himself with a man of action, and how he is not a man of action. He's more a man of thought, and that is really well portrayed later on in his actions because he really thinks about things but never acts upon them. I don't remember exactly the case, but often he would think about doing something, but he wouldn't actually follow through with it. Um, I don't know what you were gonna say, Jacob.
Well, I was just going to go back to the point about, is this a reliable narrator? And one of the things like that, I think that's a really good question. And to go deeper into it is, we were all talking about how we saw ourselves a lot into like his way of thinking, and like we saw ourselves kind of almost disgustingly reflected in that person. But if he's an unreliable narrator, I think what Dostoevsky is posing the question is, if those two things are true, is can we really trust ourselves? Which is kind of what Shaswata was alluding to, is like, is our thought process completely truthful? Should we trust what we think about even ourselves? Like, even our thought process, like not what we say, but like what we think. Is that like what we actually think? Like, I don't.
Like our internal narrative, is our internal narrative like true?
Mm.
Yeah. What is our actual desires? Does our consciousness reflect what we want?
Right. Like one thing is, it really got me thinking, like, hold on. Like, it's like we're almost fooling ourselves. Like, am I actually as good as I think I am? Because this guy is obviously not that good, and yet he thinks of himself as so good. And I see a lot of similarities between my thought process and his thought process. So perhaps like I'm actually self-aggrandizing without even me knowing, which is like, that was like not I shouldn't say shocking, but like I can't think of a better word, like a shocking moment to think about.
I guess powerful would also work in a sense.
I think on the flip side, equally likely, what I think a lot of viewers who take this novel, especially considering that a good deal of people who would read something like this, I say, would like consider themselves intellectual to some degree, would probably miss the fact that they should also think, am I also self-deprecating to a unnatural degree? Because the man is both incredibly egotistic and incredibly self-hateful. I think a fundamental issue that's brought up that I think not even the man himself would realize is like, can we trust ourselves? Can we trust the reader? But also importantly, must we? Do we need to trust any of it? Like, must there be a single meaningful higher truth for it to matter? I suppose the question is like, what matters anyways? Because the man keeps trying to justify, to give these magnificence to all the actions and thoughts and writings he has, but I think I see something a lot more simple. Like, the guy just wants to be liked and to be entertained and be accepted. I think is like one of the things that he wants that permeates through the story. It's hence why he keeps going back and forth between wanting to please the viewer, to anticipate their questions, and to interact with them as much as possible, even though he doesn't even know if it will ever be read. It's like he lacks acceptance of himself and also seeks it from others, but I think kind of has this notion that he'll never be accepted or be okay.
Mm.
A really good point. And he actually is also like kind of writing for an audience without, like, with the semi intention that all writings actually eventually, or most eventually, do get an audience even unintentionally.
I mean, like that's another thing that I was thinking about is, what if, like, because like what if the audience that like sure, it is literally on writing, and so there's literally an audience, but like what if the audience is himself, or like society in general, through through his like thoughts. Like, I don't know how to say it, but I feel like I'm almost performing for an audience through my narrative, and like do you not ever feel disgusted with yourself about some thoughts you have? And that's like, why should you feel disgusted for yourself if there's no audience for you to like have? But wait, you're the audience. Like, do you like do you ever like react to your own thought process? And like that's kind of maybe the audience that you're referring to, Yusuf, right? Like, there's no actual literal audience, and the audience is himself. Or is that not what you meant?
Yeah, that's partially like what I mean, and that's a really good point because we are often surprised by what we do. We are surprised by ourselves.
Yeah,
Yes,
like
there's even a little segment on the entirety of free will and mathematics on the point, right? Where he says that people seek to know what they do, but no one knows what they're doing.
Honestly, I think that might be a very good explanation of the actual conflict he has between his desire for free will and yet his desire to still, like present himself to society, to have companionship, because that's a thing that he lacks a lot, right? We notice that he essentially has lacked companionship, has lacked friendship, has lacked someone he considers to be his intellectual equal during the entire course of his existence. And he's trying to reconcile between that hate that he feels that he needs to have companionship, and yet the instinctual desire that he still can't get rid of to have companionship. So in a sense, all his actions might, again, this is speculation, but all his actions, like his he's proclaimed love for a toothache, his enjoyment of migraines, of stomach pains, of liver disease, and his resistance to going to the doctor despite the fact that he is sick. He's well and truly sick. His resistance might, in a sense, be an indication of that struggle, that he's trying to reconcile what he feels that he instinctually wants, and yet his hatred of the fact that this instinctual desire is controlling him. And that's might be the source of his misery, I would think. That inability to reconcile what his instincts tell him that he desires and what his literary persona tells him that he should not desire, if that makes sense.
Adding on to that does make sense. Adding on to that, I think he is writing for an audience. He just doesn't know who. Like that constant source companionship you said. Like I can also kind of really desire to like be understood or like be listened to, especially if you have communicative issues or have ideas that you find difficult to express thoroughly. I think he really wants someone to read the book, but he also, like you said, is resentful of the fact that he wants that. Like, I think this is
Yeah,
someone
exactly.
who's given up on the idea of liking themselves to some extent, that they are okay with their own abilities and thoughts and actions. And part of the reason I think is they are horrified that they are right because the conclusion they come to seems so grim and awful to them. They try to justify the actions and the sufferings of life by proclaiming that there is an enjoyment to it, that people do things because they want to, right? That people moan and complain when they have a toothache out of some strange sense of pleasure of doing the moaning, regardless of the fact that they know it's going to annoy others and isn't going to resolve the issue. And I think that fact that he takes the feelings of others into regard so often is indicative of that desire to be accepted or to just be happy. Like when he says he is envious of the common man, he is envious, I think, not that they find things of trivial matter to entertain them, but rather they find things that he can only see as trivial to be important. And that tone of him wanting to reconcile with the world but terrified that he'll push them away shows, I think, best in the second part, Apropos of Wet Snow, where he's insults the people whenever he speaks, and he shows clear remorse and wanting to fix his reputation afterwards.
Exactly. Like, for example, when he sends the letter of when he apologizes to his friend after or quasi friend after the night, and he apologizes for his behavior to try and salvage his reputation, but also it's the reputation he never really had. And so there's this like constant push and pull feeling where he's trying to regain some type of reputation so that he can feel accepted. but he never had that reputation in the first place, and he doesn't really know how to go about gaining or building such a reputation.
I think that might be part of what's so terrifying about why we're also kind of terrified by the book, is that sense of we want the things, but like, why do we want the things? And then that constant back and forth that the underground man has between, okay, I want this and I do not want this, but like, why do I want this? Why do I not want this? It kind of taps into the fear of the unknown as well, because he makes something that we just took for granted, that concept of societal relationships, that concept of acceptance among our peers. He takes that idea and casts it into doubt. And now we essentially kind of feel naked in a sense, like vulnerable to the fact that, oh, do we want this? Does this apply to me? Like, okay. And then we start thinking about, okay, why do I want what I want? And then there's a sort of terrifying consciousness to it, which is part of what his thoughts on consciousness are in the book itself.
I think even like thinking about this book is that there's really like a double narrative. There's you're reading and hearing this man's thoughts and his actions, but then you also have your own thoughts and actions, and you think about how this applies to you. And I think that's really an important part, is that you get this side where it's really different for every person, and you have another narrative going inside your head thinking about your life and how this applies to you. I think that's like a really interesting thing.
I think I personally relate to more like the primal, more childish feelings of like fear and anger the guy expresses. Like the feeling that everyone around you is going to grow up, but you're not going to be able to move on, kind of things. Like that your worldview at the worst is going to be the one that seems most correct, and you're going to spend the rest of your life desperately trying to find someone to rebut it. Like the primal fear of being alone, not being able to move on, I think connects with me a bit more than some of the loftier ideas, because personally I have considered like the existential crises styles of such things to enough an extent that I don't feel particularly surprised by most of it, but I find the sentiments still powerful.
Yeah, there is merit to that, I would say. That is that would be another aspect of the fear that's created. And now I'm thinking about it. That's very cool. Okay, now that we've talked about the narrator, what do you guys think, aside from his whole status as whether he's not a reliable narrator or not, and then his desperation between the concept of free will and then the concept of instinctual desire, which leads to his desperation that he might be the most right, and that's a terrifying thought on its own. Aside from that, what do you think about his addressing of the various ideas of like romanticism, utilitarianism, and egoism?
Hey, Shaswat, just for those people, potentially that don't know exactly what egoism is, could you just give a brief summary? I obviously know, but for the viewers.
Right. All right. In that case, first, egoism. When I talk about egoism in this case, it's that sense of personal consciousness, that sense of whatever may be, I am conscious. That idea of I'm not even entirely sure if that would refer to egoism itself, but it's that idea of I am conscious, and why am I conscious? And if I am conscious, why do I want the things that I want? That sense of self-importance almost that he portrays. That's because, like,
Almost
like
that Descartes' idea, I think, therefore I am. It's this
in a sense.
existence that is derived from consciousness.
Yeah. And in the book, that sense of egoism is relevant because it's that which creates his whole dilemma about consciousness. His idea of, okay, there's the intellectual man, but he's not intellectual in the sense that he's smart necessarily, but he's intellectual in the sense that he's more conscious. And because he's more conscious, that sign of consciousness is an inability to act. Because a conscious person will always think so much that they are unable to act. And then that leads to a jealousy in him about the common man, the brave man, who continues on to make decisions without constantly thinking about the repercussions or the results of the decisions. And there's that simplicity in that. And what does that say about, Descartes' idea of I think, therefore I am? That's what I was referring to in this case.
It's very interesting in the sense that is there an absolute truth? And I think that's why a conscious man cannot act, is because they can never really reach that absolute truth or that divinity of thought.
I think at the same time, though, that sort of thinking has a fundamental erroneous assumption, I suppose, to some extent. Like one of the axioms, I think, of the conscious man is the concept that there is an absolute truth, and of that absolute truth, there is value to it. But there's a problem with the idea that truth has value, because there's nothing innately to say that to act in the truest fashion is the best fashion, nor is there a way to say that the truest way of achieving one's value is the fashion of one which should proceed with it as well either. I think Therefore I Am is potentially a deep delving subject, but at its core is an incredibly simple idea that you are, full stop, period. Like, it's just, you exist. That's cool. There's nothing left for my philosophies to tell you about how to live that. And I think that desire to put the conscious man, to be aware of all the issues, is also this desire to have some sort of imperial measurement of importance for him. Like, he keeps trying to put such weight and elegance that's simple, as they said, simple and beautiful or something sort, onto things that innately don't have that. I think that arbitrary distinction between the conscious and the simple man haunts him, because he can't bring himself to the level of the simple man. Like, he somehow thinks that the conscious man will always be better, and the conscious man must worry. And that there's something in this, like, unbreachable between the two, of the one who acts and the one who thinks.
I think it's a sort of blissful ignorance that he yearns for, but then also sees himself as superior because he can think and he can evaluate. It's this constant tug and pull between wanting to be the regular actionable man, the man of action, and also this sense of superiority that by being the conscious man, he is achieving something greater.
But basically, yes, in the book, he does show that sense of he prides himself. He prides himself on his consciousness, and he says that, yes, that is the good thing, that is the ultimate thing. And then because of that, he has achieved. But in that same sense, he also worries about whether he has in fact achieved or not. Because, as he says, like, he brings up that idea of, okay, because of my intelligence, intelligence as a substitute word for consciousness, because of my intelligence, I must not be able to act. And because I must not be able to act, I am intelligent. And that sort of circular logic also does bring to light that sensation, like, obviously alongside with the actual chronicling of his life story, but it brings to life that sensation of he hasn't really achieved anything despite claiming to have achieved the greatest thing of all, which is consciousness.
I think that partially reflects on that desperation to have importance in existence. Like, he tries to emphasize his consciousness importance because he wants his inaction and his pain to feel like it mattered or achieved some greater purpose. Because his alternative, I think, the circumstance is to admit that he's just been miserable and poor at communication, that he's been indecisive, that he's suffered a lot for not many real reasons, right? There's something miserable in that.
That's, like, I think an excellent point, is that he's, like, almost in denial. He's in denial of his philosophy being bad, pretty much. Like, being his life has been terrible, and the only thing that's been keeping him going is this philosophy of his. And then when that, like, starts to crumble around him, it's the worst thing that could happen to him, because how can you, like, what is the ultimate goal of a person? Like, what do you want when you die, right? Like, that's like a question you guys, like, I think we all ask ourselves, right? Is it I think the answer would be satisfaction with your life, however you achieve that, right? Like, does anyone else have a better thing to want when you die?
Not really, because that is the motivation for a lot of it.
I think satisfaction in its actual like definition, uh, almost it, it is what you want. Just basically, that's what the word means, right?
That's true, but it's like, because you don't want to die with regrets, and so the opposite of having regrets is satisfaction. So you get satisfaction through a bunch of different ways, and like one of those ways is trying to find meaning through life, and then if you find that meaning, you're like satisfied, right? And so if his meaning is going away, like if he's losing his meaning in life, that's like the worst thing that can happen, since that's everybody's ultimate goal, is if not to find meaning, find satisfaction. And I think one of the major ways we gain satisfaction in life is through meaning, right? So I think that was a very roundabout way of just saying that I think Jesse's point was really, really insightful.
I think to your question of what do you want when you die, I don't think satisfaction is necessarily the thing I say. I would say like two things is either joy in the moment or peace. I don't necessarily think it has to be a joyful peace, just like an acceptance that I have lived, I think, is the ultimate expression of okay, I can die now, right? Because I think that's a problem with his thinking, is like he thinks he has to be satisfied, that he doesn't want to die with any regrets, and he's trying to turn his regrets and the time wasted into things that he can find positively. And I think the two things is like you can learn something from everything, right? But also one doesn't have to learn something from everything, because as much as humans, the pattern seeking monkeys who love to make story the purpose and intent for every natural phenomenon, not everything has such purpose or meaning. And if you don't find it, that's okay. Perhaps you'll find it later. Perhaps you'll find it never. Perhaps you'll find a meaning of it in something else. Like I think the underground man doesn't think it's okay to be not okay, and at the same time doesn't find it okay to be okay. Like he's working so hard to work through the suffering that he's not able to let it go, because it's become the only thing that he is. Like he's just his regrets. And I think over time regrets can stay regrets, but I think the pain from them can fade, along with how the fact that the joy of happy memories can fade. But the memories are ours to keep, and over time, if we learn from them, become our strength. I think that's what the underground man ultimately fails to do, to just live.
That is a good point, honestly. Because yes, he does keep ruminating. He keeps obsessing over every single choice made in his life, right? That's the point you're driving for, I think. He keeps obsessing, so all this pain that he has from those decisions, all this doubt, all this anxiety that he has, it keeps building up. And now the amount of anxiety that he has reached such a point that he can't simply just let go of it. So in a sense, yes, it could be considered that he's trying desperately. He's trying desperately to get rid of that pain by, in a sense, considering it as joy, which is why he's trying to see if he can find joy. He can find enjoyment in his toothaches, in his pains, in his liver failure. Is that sense of he has so much pain in him right now that he can't just let go of it. So instead, he's trying to convert that pain into a happiness, so that, in a sense, he can end up with at least a twisted form of happiness that maybe he can feel that it's okay. What he's done, it's okay.
Added on to that, I think he feels that he is the illness, right? Like there's some deeply rooted degree of self-hatred and loathing of everything he's done, of regret, that I think that's reflected strongest in that beginning part where he says he's a spiteful man. No, I'm not. I'm not a spiteful man. I don't know what I'm doing. When he says he doesn't want to go to the doctor, because I think part of him doesn't want to be cured of neither his physical nor whatever mental impediments he may or may not have, because to him, that is who he is right now and all he is.
Yeah. I think he does. He expresses that, and it's a little bit missable. But that's probably part. Again, along with all the other stuff that we've talked about, that's probably part of his core philosophy. That idea of I am defined by what I am not, which is usually thought of in life as like a very bad, negative way of thinking, because obviously it brings about negativity. It leads you to focus on what you are not rather than what you are. But because he genuinely feels that he is not, he is forced to consider what he's not, in a sense to try to give himself an identity of sorts. And that, in accordance with that preservation of the pain, that preservation of the anxiety he feels, leads him to be in this interesting I say, but really sad juxtaposition where he can't really move on, but he can't really look back either without having to immediately refute whatever he has just said.
I also think that the guy, although he expresses a deeply nuanced philosophy, at the same time, I think if you were to ask him personally what his philosophy is, he would ramble on for a few hours and eventually just give up that he doesn't really know. I think he's someone who knows a lot and understands nothing kind of person.
Okay, that resonates. That resonates way too much. I don't like it. I don't like how much it resonates.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in that sense, it could be an expression of just the fear that we all have, don't we? Because, like, I'd say on some level, at the very least, on at least a very minimal level, we all do have that fear that, okay, we know these things, but do we understand them? And that's kind of what leads us to our obsession with such philosophical fundamental questions like, okay, what is life? What is the universe? Why are we here? How did we come to be here? Why? Why? That question of why is any of this happening the way it is a reflection of our internal fear that we do not understand what we know. And again, that's the idea of tapping into that fear of the unknown, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think what's important for that is like so often to say to a uncomfortable person that it's okay to be not okay. I think the more important phrase is it's okay to be okay. Like it's okay not to know or not to truly understand, but still enjoy it or do things off of whims. Like it's okay to live a life where you don't know everything because perhaps you never will. It's also okay to keep seeking for it, but that doesn't mean that the only thing you can do is to seek it because we are not innately rational entities, I think. Human logic and rationality is defined by our irrational needs for life and companionship and security. Like, there's no logical reason why an organism must eat if we assume the fact that there's no logical reason for anything to live or to exist. I also think there's another thing that people find that there's some meaningful ultimate truth, like as if an ultimate truth will have a purpose, but I think that ultimate truth is just 1 + 1 = 2. There is nothing beyond that. It won't tell you what to do with the numbers. It won't tell you how to live with that knowledge. Like ultimate truth will tell you that there's a lump of steel in front of you and it is up to you whether that is a pan or a gun.
It's up to you whether that is a pen or a gun. I will be using that in the future, thank you. But again, yeah, I think he brings this up very minutely in the thing as well. Like it's that, but then is that sense of, okay, there is that ultimate truth, but is there even that degree of ultimate truth, that idea of 1 + 1 = 2? And I think he does covert that sense, that question of what is real a little bit as well, which is that sense of, okay, yes, there is an ultimate truth does not give you purpose, but does ultimate truth even exist in the first place? And that's kind of the argument behind a lot of the non-realism philosophies, which is like the philosophies that ultimately lead into ideas like, oh, the universe is all just a simulation, or the universe was created last Thursday, which is that very bizarre yet kind of interesting theory of last Thursdayism, if you've heard of it.
And what I think about that is just, well, how would I ever be able to confirm that? The ultimate truth, if I cannot perceive the ultimate truth, doesn't really exist to me. Like, I think the issue with the frame of reference is people try to do a universal frame of reference, yet perplexingly give the universe these weird human ideas. It's like when people talk about evolution, say they want to survive. No. It's like, it's whenever someone says Darwinism, as if Darwinists should be these brutal, uncaring people who create like strength and intelligence, when in reality, I would assume that Darwinism would probably be one of the most peaceful ideologies if we ever converted one into a proper ideology rather than science, because it is what is, what lives. There's nothing beyond the fact that things are. And perhaps we can identify reasons for it, but it's not up to us to choose for why they are what they are.
I think this type of idea is also discussed in 1984, where Winston is being tortured and his perception of reality is very skewed, and he doesn't know what's right. Is 2 plus 2 makes 4 a real thing, or is it 2 plus 2 makes 5? And so it's, how is our brain, can it be skewed? Can the laws of nature be changed in our own perception if we do not agree with them? And I think um, the Underground's man, he has this type of disdain to the order and the um like, you can't escape from the laws of nature, and he doesn't like that. In his conscience, he feels very suppressed by these ideas that there are some truths that cannot be debated, cannot be thought through, cannot be endlessly and tirelessly thought of until he comes to no action. And I think that's like an interesting point, is that he doesn't like absolute truths, although he's always working towards thinking of his actions in a way to gain some kind of certainty. He doesn't like certainty. Rather, he likes the process of attaining such thoughts.
Yeah. Seeing as how you brought up 1984, that's actually a pretty interesting connection you made there. So yeah, I'd like to bring up the fact that the example of Nietzsche, right? I'm able to bring this up because I had to work with him, with his philosophies quite a lot recently. But yeah, there's that sense of there was a point at which he tried to refute Descartes. He was like, okay, Descartes, yes, you think that, okay, I think, therefore I am. But what makes us think that we are thinking? Is it not our perception of the fact that we think that we are thinking? And if we think that we're thinking, is our thinking reliable? Is it really an indicative of consciousness if we simply think we are real because we are thinking? Because of the cyclical nature of such a question. And then that kind of also relates back to that sense of, okay, maybe we should just strive for peacefulness in our own minds, because that sort of absolute truth, that sort of desire to search for absolute truth, or to refute what can be considered to be absolute truth, or to refute ideas of what might be absolute truth, can only really ever lead to absolute madness, in a sense. Because you can refute it on and off and on and off and on and off. And regardless of whatever we perceive to be the case, bringing in TOK with sense perception, regardless of whatever we perceive to be the case, we can always find something else that feels to be going against that sense perception, and we can always doubt the validity of our own senses. And if we can do that, is there a point to searching after an absolute truth if we cannot pursue that absolute truth with absolute certainty?
This kind of calls about like some debates about, for example, empiricism, where we really trust everything that we see absolutely, and versus, I forgot exactly what we learned in TOK, but Jesse, you had something to say.
I think this is kind of something that I can answer through the ideologies of science. We don't seek absolute truth because we know we're going to get there, because let's face it, we're never going to get there. The more we learn about everything, the more we realize how absolutely everything we know is pretty damn wrong, right? Like, we think we know about everything, then some guy with a weird haircut that doesn't like socks decides to rewrite the physics textbooks. Or some guy gets hit on the head by the apple and decides to reinvent some fields of science himself. And I think the important part of science, though, is that we get a bit closer to something that is a bit more true, whatever true means. Yes, our senses aren't completely reliable, but they seem to be a bit more reliable than mysticism or faith or tradition. And if we don't think one of our senses is reliable, then perhaps we rely on our collective senses in different locations, at different standardizations, because frankly, we can only get closer to truth. And I suppose that in itself is worthy of a pursuit because we can achieve something out of it. And I think that science itself still fulfills those irrational needs of like emotions and food and stuff because all the goals we achieve are arbitrary, but they are goals nonetheless.
There is beauty in that, and that acceptance that yes, our goals may be arbitrary, but they're what we have, so might as well go for it, right?
Yeah, it's like, yes, saving sick kids is arbitrary, but damn it, we're human. They are our children. We might as well do something about it. If this piece of moldy bread can save 1,000,000 lives, let's damn test it.
I agree with that. Like having a goal, having that sense of continuity, that is what we live for. We live for progress, for advancement, and I think there's something really noble about advancement, about science for the purpose of making people's lives better. Just just for basically our own satisfaction, just because we are human.
Yeah, that is there. That sense of okay, if we do feel that, if we do accept that yes, everything is arbitrary, we must also accept that it does not matter if we do not matter, because even that fact that we do not matter is arbitrary. And if even that can be considered to be arbitrary, might as well just do something just for the hell of it, right? And if that something makes us feel good, even if that sensation of goodness is arbitrary in and of itself, still makes us feel good. And that's okay.
Yeah. Like, we are innately irrational entities. Like life is not a rational being because the rationale of the universe, the core components of logics, is really just maths, I would argue, and nothing beyond the observation of A plus B equals AB. However, what you define A and B as, or what plusing and equal is highly up to debate because language is horribly imperfect. I think that's why we aren't evil even at our most nihilistic, because the question becomes, well, yes, murder is technically as equally as meaningless as eating bread, but that person who's being murdered would not like it, and we as living entities do not particularly enjoy the sensation of knife, so we would kindly ask you to refrain from it, and we will set up some system to prevent you from doing the knife if we can. And I think if we accept that matter is arbitrary, then I think that we know that it only exists when something bestow upon it. So I think the ultimate sensation is that things matter when we care. And that working towards progress is we work to a point where people won't have to question the meaning of life anymore, where things are so plentiful and enjoyable that when someone is asked, hey, why does any of this exist? Then they can wholeheartedly answer, because it does.
And I'll just answer that because, yes, we have already made that answer, but be okay with that answer, right?
Yeah, that's
Satisfaction
almost more
in
difficult.
that answer.
Not necessarily satisfaction, I suppose. Like, you don't have to be happy with it, right? Like, it's fully okay to be a bit disappointed in that. Like, the way the human mind has been trained and like raised, we've always tried to be something cosmically important, like to have intent and purpose written in our universe. Like, that's why we make our gods. It's why we write our stories into the stars and the earth. And something about being less than that, of just being these lumps of carbon and oxygen, hydrogen, iron, etc., and just doing things because we happen to be here, is both amazingly beautiful in its cosmic improbability and wonderful in its complexity, but at the same time disappointing in how utterly complicated and extremely simple it is. And I think we don't have to be happy with that. We can still write our heroes in the stars and carve our monuments onto stone in the feeling that it will mean something greater than it does. But I think it's very doable to be okay with the fact that maybe it doesn't.
I'd say that's a pretty good point to end it off on, unless anyone else has any thoughts.
No, that's perfect.
I think it's really good.
All right. Well, in that case, that's the end of our discussion. I hope you all learned something today. We've come to terms with some of the things that we've read in the book and how it applies to reality as well. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.